In the quiet town of Fairhaven, nestled deep in the pines where fog clung to the streets like a second skin, there was a place no one spoke of unless dared. Fortune's Game Emporium, the old arcade at the edge of town, had once been the heartbeat of Friday nights. Its glowing neon sign, now flickering and broken, had guided generations to games, laughter, and candy-sticky hands. But in recent years, something had changed. Kids whispered about strange occurrences. Stories about a peculiar machine buried in the back corner spread like wildfire in the halls of Fairhaven High. They called it the Game of Fortune, though no one really knew how it worked. It had no buttons, no coin slot, just a single cold metallic plate shaped like a human hand. Most who tried it swore it was a hoax, but others, those who left pale and quiet, didn't talk about it at all. A few never came back to school. The dare, Aaron, Amy, and Callum were tired of being bored. Friday nights in Fairhaven had lost their spark. Amy had the idea first. "Let's do something interesting," she said, twirling a lock of her dark hair. "Something scary." Callum groaned, sprawled across Aaron's couch. "You mean like your stupid Bloody Mary game last year? Hard pass." "No, I'm serious this time. I heard something new." Amy leaned in, lowering her voice. "You know the old arcade? There's this machine that's supposed to tell your fortune, but it's creepy. My cousin said it gave her a fortune, and then weird stuff started happening." Aaron shivered but forced a laugh. "That sounds like complete nonsense." Callum perked up. "What's the catch? It's not another urban legend, is it?" "No catch," Amy insisted, "but it only works if you touch it." The air in the room shifted, tension creeping in with the idea. Aaron wasn't sure why her chest tightened, but she shook it off. It was just a stupid game. "Fine," Aaron said reluctantly, "but if nothing happens, you owe me a milkshake." The arcade. The walk to the arcade felt longer than usual. The narrow streets of Fairhaven, eerily quiet. As they approached the building, Aaron noticed the cracked windows and the sagging roof. Its once bright neon sign sputtered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew. The faint hum of forgotten machines filled the silence. Aaron could feel her pulse quicken as they made their way to the back. And there it was, the Game of Fortune. It looked untouched by time. The metallic handplate gleamed as though someone had polished it moments before. Above it, a dusty screen flickered, waiting. Amy went first, rolling her eyes at their nervous glances. "It's just a dumb game," she said, placing her hand firmly on the plate. "What's my future?" The machine groaned to life, humming low and vibrating under her palm. Then, in faint green letters, the screen answered, "You will touch a stranger, and they will follow you home." Amy snatched her hand away, laughing nervously. "Well, that's dumb." Callum stepped forward, feigning bravado. "All right, my turn. Will I ever get rich?" He placed his hand on the machine. The hum returned, and the screen lit up. "You will touch gold, but lose everything else." "Creepy," Callum muttered, pulling his hand back. "This thing's just some old scam." Finally, it was Aaron's turn. She hesitated, the weight of dread settling over her like a thick fog. "You're not chickening out, are you?" Amy teased. With a shaky breath, Aaron placed her hand on the machine. It was colder than she expected, sending an icy shiver up her arm. She swallowed hard. "What happens if I play this game?" she whispered. The machine hesitated. The hum grew louder, almost angry. The screen flickered violently before finally stabilizing. "You will touch death, and it will hold you close." The air felt heavier. Aaron pulled her hand back as if burned. Amy and Callum stared at her, their faces pale. "All right," Amy said, forcing a laugh. "Let's get out of here." The first signs. The strangeness began that night. Aaron couldn't sleep. Her room felt colder than usual, even with the windows closed. And then came the dreams. In the first, she was back in the arcade. The machine hummed louder, the sound like whispers in her ears. She placed her hand on it again, and this time, fingers, cold, skeletal, wrapped around hers, pulling her closer. She woke with a scream, her heart racing. The next day, Amy called. Her voice trembled. "There was a guy on the bus tonight," she said. "He kept staring at me. When I got off, he got off too. I think he followed me home." Erin's stomach twisted. "It's just a coincidence," she said, though she didn't believe it. That same night, Callum texted her. "My mom's wedding ring is missing, and Max, my dog, ran away. Do you think?" He didn't finish the sentence, but Erin knew what he meant. The bruises appeared a week later. Erin noticed them first on her wrist, small, faint, like the press of fingers. By the third day, they were on her arms, her neck, even her shoulders. She hadn't felt anyone touch her. Amy disappears. When Amy stopped coming to school, Erin knew something was wrong. She and Callum went to Amy's house, only to find it empty. The front door hung open, and the living room was eerily silent. On the kitchen table was Amy's phone. The last text sent was to Erin. "He's here." Callum turned to Erin, his eyes wide. "We need to go back to the arcade." The return to the machine. The arcade was darker than before, the air thick and suffocating. The Game of Fortune stood waiting, its screen flickering faintly. Callum approached first, his hands trembling. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, slamming his palm onto the plate. The machine hummed and the screen lit up. "I want to feel." Callum stumbled back, but before he could move away, the hand-shaped imprint glowed, and something black and smoke-like surged from the machine, wrapping around him. His screams echoed through the arcade as the darkness pulled him inside. Erin froze, her heart pounding. The machine's screen flickered again. "Your turn." The final touch. Tears streaming down her face. Erin placed her hand on the machine one last time. "What are you?" she whispered. The response came quickly. "I am what you've touched, and now I am you." The metallic handplate grew warm, and before Erin could pull away, she felt it. Fingers curling around her wrist, cold and unrelenting. She screamed, but the arcade swallowed the sound. Darkness engulfed her. When she woke, she was standing outside the arcade. The door was boarded up, the windows dusty. Callum and Amy were gone. Erin turned to leave, but as she walked, she noticed something strange. People on the street shivered as she passed, their faces pale. Her reflection in a shop window didn't blink when she did. And when her mother hugged her that night, Erin didn't feel warmth, only cold. She wasn't sure if she was still herself, or if the machine had taken her place. But one thing was certain. Every touch she gave now carried a part of it with her. It wanted to feel alive, and now, through her, it would. The small, leather-bound book sat innocently in the middle of the old library's clearance sale, its cracked spine and faded gold lettering betraying its age. It had no title on the cover, only the words, "The Book of Premeditation," etched in faint script on the first page. Melanie picked it up without thinking. She wasn't much of a reader, but something about the book felt compelling. It was the texture of the leather, almost too smooth, as if it had been worn down by thousands of hands but had never aged. The way it warmed in her palm made her pause, a flicker of unease passing through her. It was subtle but undeniable, like holding something alive. She glanced around. The library was nearly empty, its faint smell of mildew and dust filling the air. The elderly cashier sat at the desk near the door, reading a newspaper. Melanie held the book up. "How much for this?" The woman peered over her glasses and frowned. "That old thing? Just $1. Nobody's touched it in years." Melanie hesitated. Nobody had touched it. That seemed impossible. She handed over the money anyway, brushing the feeling aside. "Hey, good luck with that one," the woman muttered as she rang her up, almost under her breath. "What do you mean?" Melanie asked. But the woman didn't respond, already absorbed in her paper. That night, Melanie sat at her kitchen table with the book. She flipped through its pages, expecting to find recipes, poetry, or some forgotten novel. Instead, the text was bizarre, written in a strange mix of Latin and symbols she couldn't decipher. The pages seemed ancient, the parchment thin and worn, yet there was no musty smell, no sign of decay. At the bottom of each page, a single sentence stood out in bold English text. To understand the essence of touch is to hold the power of life and death. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She read them aloud, her voice trembling slightly as the sentence settled into the still air of her apartment. Melanie wasn't the superstitious type, but something about the book felt heavy. She closed it, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just some gimmicky antique, she thought, something meant to spook people. But that night, she dreamt of hands, dozens of them, pale and skeletal, reaching for her in the dark. Their fingers clawed at her skin, pulling at her arms, her shoulders, her face. She woke up gasping, her chest tight. It was just a nightmare, she told herself, nothing more. The next morning, Melanie woke feeling unusually energized. The book still sat on her kitchen table, open to a page she didn't remember leaving it on. The words at the bottom were clearer this time, sharper, almost as though they'd been freshly written. Touch is a promise, one that can never be taken back. She closed the book hastily, shoving it into a drawer. The energy she felt coursing through her didn't make sense. She hadn't slept well, and yet her limbs felt light, her mind sharper than it had in years. At work, however, things took a strange turn. Melanie was a barista at a small cafe. She wasn't one for much physical contact, but that morning when she handed a coffee to an elderly woman, their hands brushed. The woman gasped, her eyes wide with fear, and backed away so quickly she nearly dropped her cup. "Are you okay?" Melanie asked, her voice tight with concern. The woman didn't answer. She just stared at Melanie's hand, her face pale and drawn, before hurrying out the door. Melanie shrugged it off, but similar incidents began happening more frequently. A coworker flinched when their arms accidentally touched while reaching for the same mug. A friend at lunch seemed uneasy after a casual hug, retreating into silence for the rest of the meal. It wasn't until she noticed the lingering warmth in her hands after every touch that Melanie remembered the book. That night, curiosity won over fear. Melanie retrieved the book from the drawer, her hands trembling as she opened it. This time, the English sentences weren't confined to the bottom of the pages. They ran through the text, seamlessly weaving into the undecipherable symbols. The human touch is the most dangerous of all. To touch is to transfer. What you take, you keep. What you give, you lose. Her hands began to shake as she slammed the book shut. But even as she tried to push it out of her mind, Melanie couldn't deny what she had started to feel. Every touch left her with something, a piece of the other person, some intangible energy she couldn't explain. And in return, she left something behind. By the end of the week, Melanie couldn't ignore it anymore. Her hands burned constantly, and her skin felt alien to her, as though it didn't belong. The book's secrets unfold. Melanie's isolation didn't stop the dreams. Every night she saw the faces of the people she'd touched, co-workers, strangers, old friends. They stared at her with hollow eyes, their hands outstretched as if pleading for something. Their faces were twisted, their skin pale and sunken, like they were drained of life. The nightmares grew worse with each passing day. And then the changes began. Her hands no longer felt like hers. The skin became unnaturally smooth, almost glassy, as though something was pulling the texture of her humanity away. She could feel emotions through her touch now, grief, pain, joy, and fear, all coursing into her like a flood every time her skin met someone else's. Her co-workers began avoiding her entirely. Customers stopped making eye contact. Her friends stopped returning her calls. Even her parents seemed distant during their weekly video chat, commenting on how tired she looked. Melanie knew she needed answers. She turned to the book, poring over its pages for hours. The cryptic sentences grew darker, more explicit. To hold the power of life and death, one must accept the weight of the curse. Touch is not a gift. It is a burden, and burdens must be shared. The final pages held only one instruction. To be free, the touch must return home. The woman's secret, Melanie retraced her steps, searching for the elderly woman she'd touched at the cafe. She asked everyone she could about the woman, finally finding an address. When Melanie arrived at the small, decrepit house, she found the door ajar. Inside, the woman sat in a dark room, her frail body slumped in a chair. Her skin was translucent, her veins visible beneath the surface. She looked up weakly as Melanie approached, her voice a rasping whisper. "You took it from me," the woman said, "and now it's yours." "What do you mean?" Melanie demanded. "The book, it chooses someone. Always. It needs a host." The woman's hollow eyes locked on Melanie's hands, and it never lets go. Before Melanie could react, the woman reached out and touched her wrist. A burning sensation shot through her arm, spreading through her body like fire. She screamed as the pain consumed her, searing her nerves. When it was over, the woman was gone. The chair was empty, and the book of premeditation lay on the floor, its pages blank once more. Melanie picked it up, her hands trembling. The last words appeared on the inside cover, written in crimson. "The touch is yours now, and so is the curse, the aftermath." From that day on, Melanie's touch carried a new kind of horror. People she encountered grew weaker, their energy fading with every brush of her skin. The nightmares persisted, haunting her with the faces of those she had drained. No matter how far she tried to run, the book always found its way back to her. And every time she opened it, the words seemed to grow darker, hungrier, whispering promises of power and destruction. Melanie had become the keeper of the curse, and the only way to escape it was to pass it on. But now she understood. The price was too high. And so she waited, her hands trembling, for the next victim to find the book of premeditation. The rain tapped against the fogged window of her small studio apartment, a rhythmic yet unsettling sound that mirrored the growing unease in Emma's chest. She sat curled up on her couch, staring at her laptop screen. The email was still open, the words blurring together as her mind replayed her decision to take on this particular client. It had seemed harmless at first, just another freelance job as a personal stylist. The man had contacted her through her website, insisting he needed her expertise for an upcoming event. His name was Andrew Harris, and his emails were unusually detailed. He described his preferences in fabrics, his aversion to bright colors, and even how certain textures felt against his skin. Odd, sure, but not alarming. Emma had dealt with eccentric clients before, yet when she met him for the first time in the dimly lit cafe, something about his presence left her uneasy. Andrew wasn't conventionally creepy. He was soft-spoken, polite, and entirely ordinary in appearance. Perhaps too ordinary. His pale skin seemed to drink in the cafe's yellow light, and his handshake lingered just a second too long. She noticed how he avoided eye contact, but watched her hands closely as she jotted down notes. "I've never hired someone like you before," he said, his voice low and almost apologetic. "But I feel like you'll understand what I need." Emma had smiled politely, pushing down the small prickle of discomfort. A job was a job, and Andrew had promised to pay handsomely for her time. The sessions began a week later. At first, everything seemed normal enough. Andrew was meticulous, almost obsessive, about the fabrics and styles he wanted. He was particular about textures, asking her to source specific materials and describing in great detail how each one should feel. "Not too rough, but not too smooth either," he'd say, "something that feels alive when you touch it." What struck Emma as strange was how he insisted on trying everything on in her presence. Most clients were happy to trust her expertise and leave her to it, but Andrew demanded she be there for every fitting. "It's not about how it looks," he explained during their second meeting. "It's about how it feels. Clothes should feel like an extension of you." Emma nodded, though she couldn't help but notice how his gaze lingered on her hands as she adjusted the lapel of his jacket. "Your hands," he said suddenly, his tone reverent. "They're steady, delicate, but strong." Emma laughed awkwardly, brushing off the comment. "Thanks, I guess. Occupational hazard." But as the weeks passed, Andrew's fixation became more apparent. He began asking her strange questions. Do you believe in energy? Like the kind people give off when they touch you? Not really, she replied hesitantly. He murmured, staring at her hands again. You should. Some touches can change you. The words stuck with her, though she tried to dismiss them as harmless eccentricity. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze lingered just a little too long, or that his questions carried an undertone she couldn't quite place. One evening, Andrew asked her to meet him at his apartment for their final fitting. He said he had a few new items he wanted her opinion on, and claimed the lighting in her studio wasn't right. She hesitated but agreed, eager to finish the job and move on. His apartment was in an older building on the edge of town, its exterior faded and peeling. Inside, however, it was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. The walls were painted a sterile white, and the furniture was sparse and angular, giving the space a cold, clinical feel. A faint chemical smell lingered in the air, sharp and artificial. Sorry about the mess, Andrew said, though the apartment was spotless. He motioned for her to sit on the couch while he disappeared into another room. Emma's eyes wandered to a small table by the window. On it lay a collection of photographs, black and white images of hands. Some were delicate and feminine, others rough and calloused. Her stomach tightened when she recognized one of the photos. It was hers. Taken without her knowledge, it showed her adjusting Andrew's jacket during one of their sessions. Her pulse quickened, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The urge to leave was overwhelming, but before she could move, Andrew reappeared, holding a small wooden box. You weren't supposed to see those, he said softly, his expression unreadable. Emma forced a nervous laugh. I should get going. I just remembered I have another appointment. Wait, he interrupted, stepping closer. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed a strange intensity. Before you go, I want to show you something. It's important. He opened the box, revealing an assortment of objects. A ribbon, a broken watch, a child's shoe, and in the center, a glass vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. What is this? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Memories, he said almost wistfully. Each one is tied to a touch, a moment. You see, human touch carries more than warmth. It carries fragments of the soul. That's why I needed you, Emma. Your hands, they're special. Emma backed away, her heart pounding. I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm leaving. Before she could turn, Andrew grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. Don't struggle, he whispered. It's already done. A cold, searing sensation shot through her arm, spreading like wildfire. Her vision blurred, and a wave of nausea crashed over her. When she came to, she was lying on the couch, her body trembling uncontrollably. Andrew sat across from her, cradling the vial, now filled with a faint golden light. You'll feel weak for a while, he said, almost apologetic. But don't worry, I only took a piece. Emma staggered to her feet, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to consume her. She stumbled out of the apartment and into the night, the cool air biting her skin. For days she felt hollow, as though something vital had been stripped from her. Her hands, once steady and skilled, now trembled uncontrollably. Every touch, every texture felt foreign, wrong. She tried to contact the police, but Andrew had vanished without a trace. His apartment was empty, his phone disconnected. It was as if he had never existed. Weeks passed, but Emma couldn't escape the lingering coldness in her fingertips. It was subtle at first, like a faint ache, but it grew stronger with each passing day. One night as she lay in bed, she felt it. A soft, almost imperceptible pressure on her hand. It was cold, unrelenting, and unmistakably human. She bolted upright, her breath hitching, but the room was empty. The next morning, she found a small package on her doorstep. Inside was a photograph, her hands trembling and pale, clutching the edge of the couch in Andrew's apartment. Beneath it was a note, written in his meticulous handwriting. Some touches can change you. Yours changed me. The coldness in her hands crept up her arms at night, as if Andrew's touch was still there, consuming her, piece by piece. And in the stillness of her apartment, she swore she could hear his voice whispering softly, "Thank you." The house stood at the edge of a forgotten town, shrouded by thick trees and a history nobody dared to speak of. Mark stumbled upon it purely by accident, or so he thought. He was a drifter, always on the move, running from a past he rarely mentioned. That evening, after days of hiking through the dense forest, he had planned to camp under the stars, but the biting chill and the promise of a roof lured him toward the old weathered structure. The building looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Its windows were broken, the roof sagged in places, and the porch creaked under the weight of falling leaves. Yet, despite its dilapidated appearance, there was something strangely intact about it. The walls, though weathered, bore no holes or signs of collapse. It was as though the house refused to die, stubbornly holding on to its place in the world. A sign nailed crookedly to the porch read, "Do not enter." Mark smirked. He had seen enough decrepit buildings with similar warnings during his travels. They were always the same, old, unsafe, and often home to little more than mice and cobwebs. He stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching on rotted wood. The air around him grew colder, though the forest had been oddly warm for winter. He hesitated, glancing back at the woods. The fading sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the house. He brushed off his unease and pushed the door open. The inside smelled of damp wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the dim beam of his flashlight. Furniture lay scattered, as though someone had left in a hurry. A broken clock hung on the wall, its hands forever frozen at 3:15. Oddly, the dining room table was set with plates and silverware, their surfaces dulled by grime. Mark frowned, uneasy at the sight. "Weird," he muttered, his voice echoing faintly. He chalked it up to squatters or some long-forgotten ritual of abandonment. Still, the sight of the table, as if expecting guests, sent a shiver down his spine. He explored further, finding little else of note. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, each in varying states of disrepair. One room had a cracked mirror hanging above a rusted dresser. Another had a child's bed, its sheets untouched but stained yellow with age. The last was empty, save for a single rocking chair that swayed faintly as though nudged by an unseen hand. Mark decided to spend the night in the child's room. It felt the least oppressive, despite the odd placement of handprints on the cracked window. They were small, smudged, and faint, like those of a child. He rubbed at one with his sleeve, but it didn't come off. The first night, he awoke to a noise. It was faint at first, like the distant creak of a floorboard. Mark's eyes fluttered open, and he strained to listen. The sound grew louder, a slow, deliberate series of footsteps echoing down the hallway. He reached for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as he pointed it toward the door. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Mark told himself it was nothing, maybe the wind rattling the old structure or an animal scurrying through the walls. But then he felt it, a soft, almost hesitant touch on his arm. He froze. The sensation was unmistakable, like the press of fingers lightly grazing his skin. His breath hitched as he whipped the flashlight around, but there was no one there. The door was shut and the windows were locked. Dreaming, he muttered to himself. Just a dream. But when he looked down at his arm, he saw it. A faint imprint of fingers, red and slightly raised, as though someone had gripped him too hard. The doors that wouldn't open. By dawn, Mark had decided he'd had enough. He packed his belongings hastily, eager to leave the strange house and its eerie touches behind. But when he reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. He twisted the handle, slammed his shoulder against it, even tried kicking it down. It refused to move, as if something unseen was holding it shut. Panic set in as he rushed to the windows, only to find them equally immovable. He hurled his flashlight at one, shattering the glass. Cold air rushed in, but when he peered outside, he was met with a chilling sight. The forest was gone. Beyond the broken window was only blackness, a void so deep it seemed to swallow the light. Mark stumbled back, his chest heaving. His world spun as he tried to process what he was seeing. The whispers began then, soft and unintelligible, like voices carried on the wind, the presence. By the second night, Mark was no longer alone. The touches became more frequent, hands brushing against his neck, his shoulders, his legs. Sometimes they were gentle, almost comforting. Other times they were violent, yanking at his clothes or pinning him to the ground. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. He could make out fragments of words now. Stay. Please. Don't leave. The dining room was the worst. Every time he passed it, the table seemed different. Once he saw fresh food steaming on the plates, the aroma rich and inviting. Another time the plates were shattered, the tablecloth stained with something dark and wet. The truth revealed. By the third day, Mark had stopped trying to leave. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, and his mind felt fractured. The house seemed to shift around him, its hallways stretching longer, its rooms growing smaller. In the mirror of the upstairs bedroom, he finally saw them, the owners of the hands. Figures stood behind him, pale and translucent, their faces gaunt and sunken. Some were children, others adults, but all shared the same hollow eye that seemed to bore into his soul. "You're one of us now," a voice whispered directly into his ear. He spun around, but there was no one there. The final touch. On the seventh day, Mark accepted his fate. The hands no longer frightened him. They were a part of him now. He sat at the dining room table, staring at the empty plate before him. When the first rays of dawn broke through the shattered window, the house was quiet again. Mark's chair was empty, but a new plate sat on the table, perfectly clean and shining in the morning light. A single handprint marked its surface, pressed deep into the porcelain like a scar. Outside, the forest reappeared, the house waiting silently for its next guest. The dining room was bathed in the soft golden light of a crystal chandelier, casting delicate shadows on the walls. The table, meticulously set with fine china, silverware, and neatly folded napkins, gave an air of perfection. Outside, the winter wind roared, sending loose branches slamming against the frosted windows. But inside, the warm aroma of roasted meat and herbs blanketed the room. The laughter of 5 guests, old friends from years gone by, filled the house. Emily, their hostess, moved around the table with the practiced ease of someone trying too hard. Her bright smile rarely wavered, but her hands, hidden beneath the table whenever possible, trembled ever so slightly. "More wine, anyone?" she asked, her voice light but strained. The guests nodded eagerly. They were already a little drunk, their faces flushed, their laughter louder now. Emily refilled their glasses one by one, avoiding Adam's gaze as she approached his seat at the far end of the table. His eyes followed her movements, always watching, always waiting. As she poured the wine into his glass, she felt his fingers brush against her wrist. It was the lightest of touches, but it sent a cold shiver up her spine. She flinched and pulled her hand back quickly. "Thank you, Emily," Adam said, his voice low, almost mocking. She forced a tight smile and moved on to the next guest. It had been years since Emily had seen these people, her college friends. They'd scattered to different corners of the country after graduation, and for a while they'd kept in touch. But life, as it always did, got in the way. Careers, marriages, children, everything had pulled them apart. So when Emily reached out, inviting them to her home for a reunion dinner, they had all been surprised but delighted. And yet, as the evening wore on, the cheerful mood began to shift. The first strange moment came when the clock in the living room chimed 9. The sound was unusually loud, reverberating through the house like a gong. "Did you wind that thing up for dramatic effect, Em?" asked Clara, laughing nervously. Emily hesitated, then smiled. "No, it just does that sometimes." Adam leaned forward, his glass of wine in hand. "What else does this house do sometimes?" he asked, his tone teasing, but his eyes sharp. Emily laughed along with the others, but she felt her pulse quicken. As dinner progressed, the conversation turned to old stories, embarrassing moments from college, shared adventures, and memories of wild nights out. But as the others reminisced, Adam remained quiet, watching. When dessert was served, a rich chocolate mousse that Emily had prepared herself, Adam finally spoke. "Emily," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter, "I have to ask, this meal, it's extraordinary. The roast, the seasoning, everything. Where did you learn to cook like this?" Emily froze for a fraction of a second before answering. "Oh, I've just been experimenting in the kitchen. Nothing special." Adam tilted his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It doesn't taste like nothing special. It tastes unique." The room fell silent. The other guests exchanged puzzled glances. Clara broke the tension with a laugh. "Adam, only you could make a compliment sound so creepy." The others laughed too, but the mood had shifted again. By the time the plates were cleared and the wine bottles emptied, it was nearly midnight. The storm outside had grown worse, the wind howling like a living thing. "I think we should call it a night," Emily said, standing and gathering the empty glasses. "It's getting late, and the weather—" Adam interrupted her. "Before we go, I'd like to make a toast." He stood, his movements slow and deliberate. The others followed suit, raising their glasses. Emily hesitated, her stomach twisting, but she raised hers too. "To old friends," Adam said, his voice low and steady, "and to new experiences." He looked directly at Emily as he said the last word, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. The glasses clinked, but Emily barely heard it. Her heart was pounding in her chest. As the guests began to gather their coats and prepare to leave, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. A chorus of surprised gasps filled the room. "Don't worry," Emily said quickly, fumbling for her phone. "It's probably just the storm. Let me grab some candles." She moved toward the kitchen. Her steps hurried. The darkness seemed to press in around her, and she felt the cold touch of panic creeping up her spine. When she reached the kitchen, she found the drawer with the candles and matches, her hands shaking as she lit them one by one. The tiny flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the room feel smaller, more claustrophobic. As she turned to head back to the dining room, she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. "Emily!" She froze. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Emily!" She turned slowly, the candlelight trembling in her hand. The kitchen was empty. When she returned to the dining room, the guests were standing close together, their faces pale in the candlelight. "Did anyone else hear that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "It sounded like someone calling your name," Clara said. The others nodded in agreement, their expressions uneasy. Adam, however, looked amused. "Probably just the wind," he said. "Houses like this always have their little quirks, don't they, Emily?" As the night dragged on, the sense of unease grew stronger. Strange sounds echoed through the house. Soft footsteps, faint whispers, the creak of floorboards in empty rooms. One by one, the guests began to notice odd things. A shadow that didn't belong. A cold draft that came from nowhere. And then Clara screamed. The others rushed to her side, finding her staring at the mirror in the hallway. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Clara pointed at the mirror, her hand trembling. I saw someone standing right behind me." The mirror reflected only their own frightened faces. From here, the tension escalates, revealing more about the house, the dinner, and Emily's connection to the eerie occurrences. Is she the victim, or is she hiding something sinister?